mairie to encourage people to learn the local dialect, which is Occitan, which is ironic. The Canal de Midi, 17th, 18th century, and nowadays Toulouse. Do you remember I told you also about the Tudor buildings in the 15th century that got burned down after the Great Fire in 1463, and the Capitoles made it illegal to build Tudor anymore? So you have 200 merchant families during the wealthiest period of Toulouse's history, wealthier than the Canal de Midi, and they just lost their houses, but they're not going anywhere. This is all during a period of turmoil with the Huguenots and stuff like this. Every one of these 200 merchant families in Toulouse, every one of them builds one of these. They're called hôtels particuliers. They're little mini castles in the city. This is one of the smallest in the city. It's much smaller than normal, okay? I show you these because they're a common part of everyday life in Toulouse. In the city center, all 200 that were built in the 16th century, they're all still here. Every single one of them. 89 of them are like big principal primary ones, but all of them are still here. When they were built, as a result of it being illegal to build Tudor anymore, there were no rules to the building of the Hôtel Particulier, but there were 4 commonalities. First commonality, single main entrance, defensible structure, little castle in the city, that's the idea. Second commonality, they very rarely have apartments above the main door. They have a platform up there, so you can drop things on the heads of unwelcome visitors. Defensive structure. Third commonality, this is the most important of them all, every single one of the 200 built in Toulouse, every one had a well. Do you understand what that means? It means if you have dry goods in storage, you can shut the doors to your home and you are good to go in your little mini castle for many months at a time. You throw your piss and crap over the wall and everything's good to go. Fourth commonality, this is a small one, so there's only one square behind the main doors, but the larger ones, you go through the square and sometimes there's another square past some buildings and it becomes like a little village. 200 of these things built in the 16th century, typically owned by one noble family right up until World War II. After World War II, they were typically bought by one rich dude. Each one of them, that rich dude, would convert them into private apartments. I show you these places because if you were to move to Toulouse tomorrow, to the city center, there's a good chance you'd wind up living in one of these. I lived in one of these for 7 years. They're a part of day-to-day life in Toulouse. Look at Toulouse from Google Earth. You'll see hundreds of these little hidden gardens. They're in these hôtels particuliers. This one was bought by a landlord and rented as rooms. That's the most common thing. That one was bought by a bank and turned into a bank. The one round the corner was bought by offices and turned into an office. The one I'm about to show you was turned into a museum. You see what I did there? You can do that in any street in the city center of Toulouse. I wanted to show you this one, even though it's much smaller than normal, because it's representative. It's a typical one, because I'm about to show you one of the biggest and certainly the fanciest in Toulouse, which is very nice, but it's just a tourist trap and it's not at all representative of the normal ones. And if I talk long enough here, normally somebody comes and goes and I can show you inside, but it's not happening today. So I'll show you the big fancy one. This is the big one. Same thing, just different scales. It's like a private house. Yeah, private house for a whole noble family. I'll take you in straight away in a second. But do you see what I mean with this one? This is a Hôtel Particulier. The other one I showed you is one of the smallest. Not the smallest, but one of the smallest. This is one of the biggest. Do you see what I mean by little castle in the city now? Do you also remember I told you that limestone was bling? You know, it's gratuitous. Anyway, I'll take you inside.
disparu, compagnon de mon âge.
So nowadays, Toulouse, the least pretentious city any of you will see in your lives. Just engineers and students. That's nowadays Toulouse, okay? Back then, between the 14th and 18th century, this city was pretentious like Florence or Venice under the Borgia popes. Everything was status. The ultimate status symbol in the city was these stupid towers. Who was mentioning it? So the towers, the only people who were legally allowed to build a tower on top of their house in Toulouse were the mayors, the Capitoles. So Tudor buildings with these minaret towers, then you had the Great Fire, you couldn't build Tudor anymore, so they all built these little Italian Renaissance castles with the stubby towers. And the towers are shorter than they used to be because one of the things that changed, pre-fire, if you got elected to Capitole, the next day somebody'd show up at your house and they'd say, how high do you want your tower? And the answer was always the same, higher than the last guy's. So the towers got taller and taller and dumber. And then the fire came, and the Capitoles made two laws. One, no more building Tudor, it goes Bernie. And the second law was they put a maximum height to the towers with regards to the nearest rooftops. So the mayor's houses went from these Tudor mansions with minarets, I'll show you one when we get out of this place, to these mini Renaissance castles with the stubby kind of fancy towers. Remember I told you 3 periods of wealth in Toulouse? Nowadays, the 17th, 18th century Canal de Midi, and the wealthiest period of all, the 15th, 16th, that was this. That was this frivolity. It's beautiful. It's a fundamentally annoying building for me because it doesn't make sense in a million different ways. Not a million different ways, but about 20 different ways it doesn't make sense. If any of you study history, but I imagine history is a bit like studying mathematics. I don't know mathematics, but the great thing about mathematics, I imagine, is it makes sense. You know what I mean? History's the same thing. If something doesn't make sense, then you just haven't studied it enough. If you dig deeper, eventually you'll see why they did this or why they did that. The political reasons of the family. People don't do things for random reasons. This building is full of nonsense bullshit that makes no sense whatsoever. It used to drive me a little bit crazy. This was never a government building until the mid-20th century. And that this site, even before this building was built in 1523, this site, whatever the big thing was going on in Europe for 1,000 years, whatever a century in European history would be known for, whenever it was reflected in the southwest of France, it kept taking place here for no reason. I'll give you some examples, you can judge for yourself. Do any of you know what the Eurovision Song Contest is? Do any of you not know what it is? Eurovision, do you know what the Eurovision is? You, dude?
No idea.
Perfect. Okay, the Eurovision Song Contest is the stupidest competition we have created as a species. I never miss it. It's like knowing when a train is going to crash. I'm there every year with my beer and popcorn. Don't make no mistake. Every country in Europe chooses a pop act to represent them in a competition with their skill is absolutely irrelevant. But because always Northern Europe votes as a bloc against Southern Europe, and nowadays Israel and Australia are the tiebreakers. Please don't ask me why they're in it. What people don't know.
We don't know either.
Nobody knows. I think it was just to break up the block of North. Anyway, what people don't know is the Eurovision Song Contest is very loosely based upon a much, much older competition. What? No. Les Jeux Floraux, which was bigger than the Saint Rome. Do you remember how I told you the capital city of Toulouse troubadour culture was always Toulouse in all of Europe? In the 14th century, 1323, the mayors of Toulouse formalized this by making a competition where the 9 best troubadour groups in the world would be invited to Toulouse to come and compete for a solid gold flower. The Eurovision Song Contest in the 14th century took place here, 250 years before this building was built. Okay? You all know who Galileo is? Right, Galileo, just very quickly, if you don't know who it is, he is the completely different branch of science from Darwin, but the exact same origin story as Darwin. which everybody knows. Galileo said a lot of things about the natural universe that the church did not appreciate. The church made him recant them instantly, but just like Darwin, his ideas were already out there. What people have forgotten about with Galileo for the next 2 years after his ideas became public, every institute of higher education in Europe went nuts undertaking the Galileo debates, the product of which was a distillation and a separation of science, in Western science, into two camps, religious science and science, and religious science died out. Galileo did more to break the back of the power of the church. I could go into it. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The Galileo debates took place here in the southwest of France, 80 years before this building was built. 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, what I call the age of the explorers. It's when half of the interiors of all the continents on planet Earth were mapped. A lot of people think the continents were mapped by countries. They were not. They were colonized by countries. They were mapped by special interest groups, usually with names like Geographical Society. Geographical Society were not government-run agencies. They were private rich men's clubs. They had a big bunch of rich dudes with a big pile of maps, and they wanted a better pile of maps than the Geographical Society in London or Berlin. So what do? You find a bit nobody's got, you send a young man out to go and map it or die. All the unimportant original mappings were done by these geographical societies. During the Age of the Explorers, do you want to know where the Geographical Society for France was? Here. I'll give you one more. 19th century, the century when we made our greatest advances in medical science of all time. Except nowadays. Nowadays we're doing crazy freaking shit, right? In the 19th century, any of the rare cities in Europe that had a medical school or a surgical school in them, there was such a need by the medical students in that city for fresh cadavers to experiment on that an entirely new career took form that had never existed before anywhere. It was called resurrection men. Do you know what a resurrection man is? Body thief. Digs up freshly buried graves, sell those to the medical students at great profit. I'll give you an example. Edinburgh, 19th century, home to the largest medical school in the world. During the 19th century, you could not bury a loved one in a graveyard in Edinburgh without paying a guard to watch over the grave for the first 12 days until the body's so rotted it's no good to these resurrection men. There was so much money to be made in this trade, they turned to murder. You need a 13-year-old girl for next Tuesday? Boom. Why is she still warm? Don't ask. Look up Burke and Hare. This is their story. Any city in Europe that had a medical school or a surgical school in it, and they were rare in the 19th century, had these resurrection men. You want to know where the School of Surgery was for the south of France? It was here. You don't need to believe me for any of these things. Come and check out the plot. The plot will not seem amazing unless you keep in your heads this was never a government building until the mid-20th century. I know of 2 Hotel Particuliers within 100 meters of this place that are bigger than this place. They're not as fancy as here, but even before this was a Hotel Particulier, this was an important site. If you asked me what happened here during the Visigoths, the Merovingians, the Carolingians, I couldn't tell you. And it's not from a lack of research. But back when this was a Roman city, do any of you watch parliaments? Any parliament in the world. All parliamentary systems on planet Earth are based upon a much older system called Roman Forum. Roman Forum did not have political parties, but they all had a dude. Every modern parliament has. The British call him the Speaker of the House. He chooses the subjects debated that day in the parliament or forum, but gets no vote. He's called the Magister in Roman times. Do you want to know where the Magister of Roman Toulouse, the forum of Roman Toulouse, lived? You're standing in the front garden of his domus. I don't know why these things keep happening here. The things I mentioned, they are the biggest things. But there's lots of little things about this place that make no sense. Do you see the door knocker? That's a 16th century door knocker. Everybody was midgets in the 16th century. Can you tell me why it's so hard? I don't know. I know I'm meant to have the answers. I don't have the answers. All I can do is share my annoyance and show you something else. And then I researched and I found out that every hotel particulier had a wooden framework outside with a bell on a rope, because it's really hard to pull your horse or carriage near enough to the front door. So the front door knockers were always for the pedestrian traffic. I found out last year, I believe this is the answer, but I don't know. One of you guys, one of you tourists, was an architectural historian, and I was discussing with him, and he said they have a theory on rich people's houses. They suspect they put the door knockers high to make you feel like you're visiting daddy's house, to make you feel small. I can buy that, you know what I mean? Because it's very common to rich people's houses, but I don't know.
Et pourtant tu pars seul et nu au pays des yeux perdus.